There have been about 26 decades in American history going back to our independence in the 1770s. 2.5 centuries of heroism, heartbreak, atrocity, and liberation. And before that, there were another 17 decades of English settlement in what is now the contiguous United States, which laid the foundations for the country that would become the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. Some decades have been prosperous, some have been ruinous, and some have just been downright chaotic. America, like many countries, has been through many hardships, and there can be a lively debate on what America's worst decade has been. The 1850s and 60s, the 1930s, the 1790s, and of course the 1960s are all times when the wheels seemed like they were falling off, but in my opinion, none of them compare to an older decade, when the country was still finding its footing as a set of colonies on the eastern seaboard. So today, we're looking at what I think is the best candidate for the worst decade in American history. As always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when I upload, and let's get right into the video. On a Wednesday, America's most destructive decade began. It would be another century before the ancestors of those who lived and worked on that Wednesday declared independence from the mother country. In 1670, what would become the United States was made up of 9 English seaboard colonies: Virginia, Plymouth, Massachusetts, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, and the newest addition, Carolina, which of course would eventually split. Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Georgia would not be formed until the next decade, and New England, of course, would change with time as well. Alongside English colonists, a patchwork of native groups variously interacted with or fought the settlers. Just south of the English holdings was Florida, a Spanish colony, and to the north lay Quebec and Acadia, which belonged to the French. Each of the regions of the seaboard would have its own turmoil, but the most destructive episodes would occur in the dual hearts of the colonies, Massachusetts and Virginia. A century before the Revolutionary War, social upheaval would turn violent, and the ensuing developments have been considered by some as America's pre-revolution. The 1600s on the eastern seaboard was extremely dynamic. In the span of 100 years, the coast went from having virtually no European settlement to being one of the wealthiest places in the world. As such, the start of the 1670s, while perhaps dramatic for our time, was relatively tame. The new decade brought a new English colony, Carolina, which was founded in 1670 at what is now Charleston. 7 years later, the Carolinians would have a minor rebellion called Culpeper's Rebellion in response to the implementation of taxation on tobacco exports. This rebellion failed, but nonetheless, it was a rebellion. Up the coast, in the middle colonies, the English fought for control of lands they had taken from the Dutch the decade before. The colonies of New York and New Jersey were briefly reoccupied by the Dutch in 1673 during the Anglo-Dutch War as well. As we see, these middle and southern colonies had some turnover and drama, but it was further north that the 70s really turned dark. Seventeenth-century New England was unique among the American colonies. It had largely been settled by religious dissidents known as Puritans who hoped to create a new, more upright and godly society. The Puritans were generally middle class, often skilled workers and businessmen who valued local community and church, and as such their settlements tended to be more compact and more economically wealthy and diversified. By 1675, the population of the New England colonies reached 52,000, triple that of the local native groups who had once dwarfed the settlers in number decades earlier. These local native groups were forced into subservience by the English, with tribal leaders having to abide by English law and pay tribute to colonial governments. These leaders, called sachems, and their tribes were often the victims of arbitrary abuse by the English, who would force them to appear in court over mere rumors, and then they would have to pay the English judges for their time. Some natives had converted to Christianity and lived in praying towns near English settlements, but the large majority of natives were alien to the English way of life, and were well aware that with time, their lands and people would be completely destroyed. Across the southern New England colonies, three main native groups persisted in force: the Narragansett, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag. Historically, these groups, along with others, did not have strong relationships together, but the emergence of a common enemy in the English increasingly bonded some of these groups together. As their lands were taken, their crops were destroyed, and their laws increasingly tread upon by the English, the sachem of the Wampanoag, Metacom, began to prepare for war. Metacom, also known by his Christian name King Philip, may not have actually had a solid plan or even a solid alliance network for conflict with the English, but he and those around him felt that they had to do something. At this point, anything was better than a slow, grinding destruction of everything they knew under the British heel. In June of 1675, war was imminent. Metacom had refused to appear before the Plymouth government to pay his tribute, while word from a praying Indian tipped off the English to a planned rebellion. That praying Indian was in turn killed by fellow natives, and instead of leaving the justice for the killing to the natives, like the English had always done, they instead tried and executed the perpetrators themselves, further exacerbating tensions. Finally, on June 20th, Wampanoag warriors conducted raids around Swansea, although no one was killed. The town was strategic as it sat on the isthmus connecting the Mount Hope Peninsula, where the Wampanoag were located, to the rest of the mainland in Rhode Island. After a native was killed 3 days later, a large-scale attack on the town took place, and the war was on. Both sides scrambled to make alliances. Like the natives, the New England colonies were not all controlled by a central polity and often didn't work together. Plymouth and Massachusetts, as well as Maine, which was part of Mass at the time, dispatched forces quickly, but Rhode Island stalled initially, and Connecticut never strongly joined in on the action. On the native side, the Wampanoag made common cause with the Nipmuc, while the Connecticut tribes of Pequot and Mohegans worked alongside the colonists. Further north, the Pennacook did what they could to stay neutral, retreating north, while the more remote Penobscot and Androscoggin natives of Maine fought against the colonists. Through the summer and fall, a series of raids across New England decimated the countryside. Despite common myth, natives made heavy use of muskets, and in some cases were actually better equipped and trained than the English, since they didn't have laws governing who could and couldn't own a gun, and Dutch trade gave them more reliable doglock guns than the English matchlocks. Despite this, the natives relied on a hit-and-run style of warfare. They would disperse when their scouts spotted a large enemy force, robbing the English of decisive victories, and then they would raid settlements, usually ones that had wronged them in the past. These raids would kill militiamen and civilians alike, while also burning buildings and destroying cattle and crops, depriving the settlers of food and shelter as winter approached. In turn, the English relied on a garrison system where local militias in a town would fight out of fortified houses, saving their populations, but often surrendering the rest of the town for destruction. Offensive attempts by the English usually failed, since they had trouble finding the natives in the first place. The first key battle took place in August of 1675, when Massachusetts militiamen went west to try and ally with the Nipmuc, unaware of their alliance with Metacom. While headed to a supposed meeting point with the tribe, the militia was ambushed in a swamp, but managed to retreat to Brookfield, where they holed up for 2 days under siege, until reinforcements came to drive off the natives. The next month, there was another costly English defeat at what became known as the Bloody Brook. In the isolated Connecticut River Valley, Massachusetts troops tried to consolidate their grain reserves in the town of Hadley, but they were intercepted by the Nipmuc. 70 militia were killed, and the valley's harvest for the winter was lost. All the while, towns were being destroyed left and right, at Deerfield, Northfield, Costco, Springfield, and Saco. The settlers struggled to fight back, and there was concern that the Narragansett tribe situated between the Connecticut Valley and the coast could effectively render the former indefensible. So in the winter of 1675, about 3,000 men ventured into what is now Rhode Island, searching for the base of the Narragansett. At the same time, Metacom and his forces retreated west to the Berkshires, hoping to gain the alliance of the Mohawk natives. However, the Mohawk had for decades been working alongside the English, and they struck at the New England natives, damaging them when they were most vulnerable. In December, the New England militias discovered a massive Narragansett fort in the middle of a swamp near modern-day West Kingston, Rhode Island. Led by native guides, the English prepared to take the fort, and after finding a weakness in the defenses, stormed in and killed everyone in sight. About 200 militia died in the fighting, but hundreds of natives were killed as well, mostly civilians, while the survivors who escaped were doomed to freeze in the New England winter. While the English had been brutal to the natives before, this particular episode was especially vicious, causing a stir in England even, and leaving many to question if the settlers had themselves lost the civility that was supposed to have separated them from the natives. At the same time, praying Indians, once seen as exemplars of Christian evangelization, were persecuted. Fearing they would turn, the praying Indians of Massachusetts were interned on Deer Island in Boston Harbor through the winter. While they were eventually moved, the number of deaths was a mortal blow to the once friendly population. Despite native setbacks, Metacom and his Nipmuc allies returned to ravage New England before the war was out. In February, the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and newly embroiled Narragansett attacked Lancaster, Massachusetts, followed by Medford. Frontier towns including Groton and Simsbury were being willingly abandoned by the English, and the native strikes deep into colonies shook the English to their core. On March 26th, 55 militia were killed at Plymouth, while Providence, Rhode Island was destroyed 3 days later. The New England army continued to suffer from starvation and disease, while natives won yet another critical victory in April at Sudbury, killing 74 settlers. But this was the high watermark for Metacom. Through the summer, the native coalition ran short on ammunition and morale. Despite their victories, the natives usually suffered as many, if not more, casualties than the New Englanders in their engagements. Plus, new tactics pioneered by Benjamin Church led the day, who instead of trying to fight in a European style, decided to learn from his enemies. Using captured natives as spies, he released them back to their people in order to find their defenses and location. Then, moving through less traveled areas, or at night, the English would attack a village with full force, killing anyone they could find and destroying their sources of food. Such tactics succeeded to functionally disable the Nipmuc at Turner's Falls in May of 1676, and as their sources of food were attacked, the natives took even less offensive action. By summer, the war was all but over. In August, Metacom returned to his lands at Mount Hope, where his family was captured. Days later, his camp was ambushed in the night, and he was gunned down by a praying Indian as he tried to make his escape. Over the next weeks and months, the settlers mopped up anyone they saw as a threat. Metacom's second-in-command, who was likely present at the first Thanksgiving 55 years earlier, was captured and executed, while natives who fled the region were persecuted. In a particularly cruel instance, the Pennacook natives alongside Wampanoag and Nipmuc refugees were lured to a feast of friendship in Dover, New Hampshire. Once there, the natives were surrounded, with some being sent for execution in Boston and others sold into slavery. Lower intensity fighting continued in Maine for almost 2 more years, and these natives were actually more successful, ending up with more favorable terms. When it was all said and done, the war, which would become known as King Philip's War, became the most destructive conflict per capita in American history. Between 2,000 to 3,000 New Englanders died, about 4 to 6% of the region's population. For reference, the Civil War, while much larger numerically, didn't kill more than 2% of the country. Further, about 25,000 pounds of damage was done, and the New England economy didn't recover to the same degree until the time of the Revolution a century later. but far greater damage was done to the Native Americans of New England. Numbers are hard to come by, but casualty numbers are often put at about 5,000 people, between a third and a half of their pre-war population. The war permanently changed relations between settlers and natives. Prior to the war, relations had been tense, but relatively coexistent, even if dominated by the English. After, the English could never trust the natives again, just as the natives, even those who tried to assimilate, could never again trust the English. The settlers had always felt superior to the natives, but after the war, they also felt existentially threatened by them. The wholesale massacres of natives became common in a way they hadn't before, and even native groups who were no threat were seen as enemies in waiting. King Philip's War decimated the natives of New England, and it traumatized the English settlers there, living large in their collective consciences for decades to come. And further south, native hostilities also played a role in the chaos of the 1670s. But while the clashes here were less lethal, their effects were possibly far, far more impactful. As Virginia and Maryland entered the 1670s, a social crisis was brewing. To this point, most of the labor used in these colonies was not native or African slaves, which were relatively rare, but white indentured servants from Europe. These indentured servants would sign a contract, usually with a rich landowner who would pay their way across the Atlantic in return to 3 to 7 years of labor. The work was hard, and death from disease was extremely common, but if a servant survived his term, he was granted land of his own, and by extension, he gained the ability to vote in the local government. Despite being a large area, by the 1670s Virginia was strapped for land. Most acreage was owned by a small group of elite plantation owners, and for fear of upsetting relations with the natives, the Virginia government tried to rein in further expansion of frontier settlement. The wealthy benefited from this, since they could keep workers on their lands at a low wage, while retaining more political power for themselves. This, however, meant that there was a growing underclass of white men who were being denied social, political, and economic rights that they had been promised, and with high death rates and a significant shortage of women in the colony, these men were increasingly desperate and erratic. The powder keg was lit in the spring and summer of 1675 when a plantation owner on the Potomac, Thomas Matthews, ripped off local Doeg natives. In retaliation, the Doegs tried stealing some of Matthews's pigs, but they were intercepted in their canoes trying to cross the river, and some were killed in the ensuing fight. Weeks later, trying to avenge their losses, the Doeg raided Matthews and killed one of his workers, prompting a militia response by Virginia's Stafford County. The response accidentally killed 14 natives of the wrong tribe, the Susquehannock, who were actually allied with Virginia, and they in turn decided to avenge their deaths by killing 2 Virginians. After the eye for an eye affair, the Susquehannock hoped to make peace, but the frontiersmen of Virginia believed that the attacks were the beginning of a new native war. Soon, the Virginia and Maryland government mobilized against the Susquehannock, besieging their fortress at the mouth of Piscataway Creek in September. However, the siege failed, and the natives were able to escape into the hinterland before renewing attacks against the frontier in the winter, killing dozens. Keep in mind, this was happening at the same time as King Philip's War, and the colonizers' perception was that they were facing an imminent existential threat. The Virginia governor, William Barclay, opted for a measured approach to the issue, hoping to only attack the offending Doeg and Susquehannock natives and building a series of forts on the frontier. However, others wanted to go farther, ditching the forts for offensive attacks on native settlements and not discriminating between the different tribes. It was only a matter of time, so the logic went, before these friendly native groups turned on them. Besides, there was a massive demand for more land to settle. One of the loudest voices on this front was Nathaniel Bacon, a rich plantation owner who had only come to Virginia from England a year before and had settled on the frontier. Bacon was deeply critical of Governor Barclay's moderate attitude towards the issue, and after realizing his popularity with the local militia, led a force to target the Susquehannock in direct violation of the colony's law. Bacon and his men found the fortified village of the Occaneechi tribe, who had actually ratted out the Susquehannocks to the Virginians. The Occaneechis worked with Bacon and attacked the Susquehannocks on Bacon's behalf, but after a disagreement on splitting the loot, a fight broke out and Bacon's men massacred hundreds of his allies. Back in Jamestown, Barclay tried to rein Bacon in before declaring him a traitor and calling for his arrest, while at the same time acknowledging his own unpopular actions and calling for elections for new burgesses to convene on the issue. But Bacon took advantage of this and was elected to the burgesses, albeit possibly through coercion, and as such he made his way to the capital to take his place. After a confrontation, he was arrested and then pardoned by the governor after saying he was sorry. Then he marched his forces into Jamestown to demand a commission to go after the natives, threatening to shoot the burgesses. The burgesses then caved, and Bacon built an army, this time pursuing the friendly Pamunkey natives. Barclay fortified Jamestown while other rebels attempted to build a navy, hoping to wrestle control of the colony for Bacon and hold power until they could plead their case to the King of England. To strengthen his position, Bacon promised freedom for servants and even African slaves under Barclay, and pushed men he encountered to swear an oath to him and his cause. By the end of the rebellion, one of the major strongholds of Bacon's cause would mostly be made up of black slaves. Notably, Bacon's cause was not independence, but rather to change the local government, which he saw as elitist and acting against the population's and the crown's interests. While the oath he had people swear mentioned resisting royal forces, this was only until the king was able to hear their case. Bacon, now too far gone for a pardon, laid siege to Jamestown, kidnapping wives of the burgesses and standing them in front of his forces as human shields while they dug in their lines. After a series of inconclusive skirmishes, the government fled across the bay. Bacon took the town and realized it was indefensible, and as such, he burned the capital on September 19th before spreading his forces out to defend the colony. Barclay and the local elites were panicking, not just because their personal estates were being raided, but because there was a real possibility that the even more discontented populace across the Potomac in Maryland may raise up in rebellion as well. After all, a group of men in Calvert County attempted to overthrow the local government for similar reasons that same month. But just a month later, Bacon died of disease, likely typhus, and the worst fighting was yet to come. For 3 months, the Loyalist forces and rebels traded territory along the Virginia peninsulas, all while the Susquehannock continued to raid frontier settlements. The Loyalists, largely based out of Accomack on Virginia's eastern peninsula, controlled the waterways and tried to blockade the rebels. The Baconites, led by Joseph Ingram after Bacon's death, were stationed in garrisons along the James and York rivers and mostly controlled the land. The northern peninsula, especially around Gloucester County, was quite fluid and shifted hands a lot. And through November and December, the Loyalists made steady progress raiding garrisons along the York. By Christmas, they made similar headway along the James. In mid-January, key garrisons along the York, notably at West Point, began to surrender, and the rebellion crumbled soon after. Hundreds of settlers and natives died in the conflict, but the exact numbers are unknown. Barclay, for his part, began executing leaders of the rebellion en masse. Bacon's rebellion was over in January of 1677, and at the end of the month, the first of 1,100 royal troops arrived to restore order and relieve Barclay of his governorship, hoping to ease the woes of the populace. Besides curbing the excessive reprisals of the governor, the Royal Commission under Colonel Herbert Jeffreys did little to solve the issues, and the commander, alongside most of the royal soldiers, died in a couple of years from disease. Local rule was soon restored, and the royals went home. Arguably, the effects of Bacon's rebellion, while less destructive, were greater than those of King Philip's War. While the New Englanders were able to increasingly dominate and essentially avoid the natives, the different classes of white Virginians still had to live together, and in order to create a sustainable arrangement, changes to the social order had to be made. The elites realized they couldn't repress the lower class free whites indefinitely, and so they had to play nice. Plus, if they did start to lose control of the poor whites, they would lose control in a rebellion, in turn forcing the crown to take a more direct role in the colonies, which would only further weaken the local elites. Over the coming years and decades, poll taxes dropped radically, and greater efforts were taken to ensure enough land was available for indentured servants. Social conventions among the elite changed, who increasingly practiced condescension. While the term is negative today, at the time it was an improvement, seeing the elites show public respect to lower class whites. At the same time, there was a marked reduction in the use of white indentured servants as labor in order to reduce the number of eventually free whites who needed to be catered to. By the 1700s, African slaves became a much more common form of labor, plus, in order to get new land, Virginia and other colonies took a more hardline stance against the natives, displacing groups that had previously been friendly. The in-groups and out-groups of society had changed. Now, natives and African slave revolts were a deeper concern than white uprising, which in turn contributed to a rally around the flag effect and increased racial solidarity between the various classes of white settlers. The 1670s in what became America were extremely violent and tumultuous. Not only were the wars, especially King Philip's War, destructive, but their consequences for how the colonies operated reverberated through history. The militant exclusion and expulsion of natives, class warfare, and the need to replace whites with a black slave class laid the groundwork for the darkest sides of America's history. The 1670s not only gave us America's worst war, but also America's original sins. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.